Hello and welcome to day 3 of Roots. Today I'll be walking you through a brief history of the time periods of yoga. Now this is not an exhaustive resource on the history of yoga, but it's a decent starting point for beginning to understand the evolution that yoga has gone through across the ages. So the first time period we're looking at is known as the Vedic Age, and it took place somewhere around 4500 to 1500 BC. This age is characterized by a lot of ritual and ceremony and sacrifice. There were many chants and mantras and invocations that were used and practiced during this time. The Vedic Age is the first time that we saw the word yoga come up in written text. However, it wasn't written down, what yoga is or how to practice it. At this time, the practices and the traditions of yoga were passed down orally. There were 4 books associated with the Vedic Age, and they're known as the Vedas, or the books of knowledge. One of the books is known as the Rig Veda, and a very ancient chant. Some of the most ancient chants and prayers come from this book, the Rig Veda. One of them being the Gayatri Mantra, and I'll be walking you through that mantra in a separate video. Another book is known as the Yajur Veda, and within this text is what's called the Shanti Mantra, or the peace chant, and I'll be sharing with you that chant in a separate video as well. Maybe you've heard of Ayurveda or the Ayurvedic system, and it was during the Vedic Age that this Ayurvedic system was beginning to be developed. And this is basically a science of life or of living, and it's this kind of holistic approach of integrating all aspects of our being for health and longevity. So if you've heard of Ayurveda, it comes from this time period. The Upanishad age took place roughly between 1500 and 1000 BC. So the principal texts known during this time are called the Upanishads, and this age is really known for its shift of focus into more of an internal sacrifice and really trying to discover and uncover who we really are. It was during this time and in the Upanishads that the koshas come up. There are 5 koshas, and they represent different sheaths of our being. And they go from the most superficial physical layer of our being to the deepest internal layers of our spirit or our soul. And I'll just briefly list what the koshas are now. They are first the Annamaya kosha, which is related to the physical body, the Pranamaya kosha, the energetic body, Manomaya kosha, the mental or emotional body, Vijnanamaya kosha, the intuitive body, and the 5th being Anandamaya kosha, or the bliss body. I'm not going to go into too much detail about these now because we will go into them in more depth on day 21 of this series. But just be aware that this is the time frame, the Upanishads, when there is more of this internal focus and this drive to really figure out who we are. The next age is known as the pre-classical or epic age, and it took place roughly between 1000 and 100 BC. This is where we find the text, the Mahabharata, and within the Mahabharata is found the Bhagavad Gita. And maybe you've heard of this text. The Bhagavad Gita tells this epic story of a metaphorical battle between good and bad, or choosing right and wrong. What I'll do is I'll have a link below this video that goes to a YouTube video of some classical chanting of the Bhagavad Gita, so you can get a sense of what that is. You can also look up the Bhagavad Gita and learn more about its story. In fact, a modern take on the Bhagavad Gita is the movie The Legend of Bagger Vance, or Badger Vance. If you want to understand better what the Bhagavad Gita is and the story it tells, you could watch that movie. It's during this age that the 4 paths of yoga show up. So the 4 paths of yoga are first Bhakti Yoga, and this is the yoga of devotion and of heart-centeredness. Then is Jnana Yoga. That is the yoga of knowledge and wisdom. Next is Karma Yoga, and that is the yoga of action, and specifically of action without attachment to the outcome. And the 4th path of yoga that's outlined in this time is Raja Yoga, also known as the Royal Path. This is where we begin to learn from direct experience, and we learn how to control the mind. And we talked about that yesterday, all these fluctuations of the mind, the goal of yoga being to reduce these fluctuations so that we can perceive what's underneath them. Next is the classical age of yoga, which took place roughly between 100 BC and 500 AD. The principal text, one of the principal texts during this time frame, is Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. And this is the path of Raja Yoga. Patanjali offered the first codified system of yoga. Although it had been practiced for thousands of years prior, it had just been passed on through oral tradition. The Eightfold Path, or the 8 limbs of yoga, include the yamas, the niyamas, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi. And we'll go into these 8 limbs in more detail tomorrow. Next is the post-classical or tantric age, and this is the time period of yoga that has taken place after 500 AD up until our current modern day. One of the primary texts during this age is the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, and it's during this time frame that physical postures, the asanas, are expounded on and described in more detail. Whereas in more ancient practices, physical postures they didn't play as big of a role in the practice, aside from seated postures and postures that allowed previous practitioners to sit for long periods of time in meditation. So it's during this age, the tantric age, that the body is viewed as a tool that can be used to help us realize the divine within ourselves. This is where Hatha Yoga and where Kundalini Yoga show up in history. This ultimately is the yoga that we are familiar with today. So some of the modern lineages and yoga teachers that maybe you've heard their names, I'd like to outline for you so you can kind of understand where these people come from and where these practices have originated from. So Krishnamacharya is known as the grandfather of yoga, and he really, he's known for a style of yoga called Vinaya Yoga. And this style, it really emphasizes adapting a yoga practice to an individual and their needs. So it's all about making yoga work for each individual person, not about a cookie cutter approach, very much about adapting and modifying and making yoga work for each person as an individual. And Krishnamacharya had several students. You may recognize some of their names. They include Iyengar. Iyengar is very well known for his practice, for his physical practice and being very precise in poses. There's Pattabhi Jois, Indra Devi, and TKV Desikachar. Now, Desikachar is Krishnamacharya's son, and He passed in 2016, so he was with us very recently, and he played a huge role in developing and helping us understand what yoga is. And some of the Western teachers who either had a personal relationship with Desikachar or who were really influenced by Krishnamacharya and his teachings include teachers like Gary Craftsell, Mark Whitwell, Larry Payne, Sonia Nelson, Richard Miller, and Leslie Kaminoff. So these are some of the modern day teachers who continue to pass on the yoga of Krishnamacharya and the yoga of Desikachar.